Here we go. Looks like we're live. We're live. We're on. Okay. Well, here we are again, and this is actually probably the first time that you've seen one of these. I recorded a 4-part series, and I tried to keep it short, but then as I was going through it, I was like showing the detail in what I was finding and what I've learned that other people have shown me. And so what I ended up doing is going uh, diving really deep in my videos. So I've got a 4-part series that's about 6 hours long in total, and I know that seems like a lot, but I decided that I would do kind of a summary video, and with the thoughts of that kind of shows why we left the church. And then if you're interested, which I would highly encourage you to check out the rest of these videos, especially if you're somebody that I know personally. I think, I guess if you trust me, then you might trust some of this information a little more. You make the call. I know President Nelson has recently said, don't take advice from people who don't believe. So that might stop you right there. But I would argue that critically thinking on your own is a valuable thing, something that I've learned through this process. So first, let me just state my intentions. Is I've been feeling very strongly that I should provide a video out there for anybody that I know that might be questioning, why did Kimberly and Jason leave the church? They might, make their own assumptions of why we just wanted to live a life of sin or whatever, which is certainly not the case. But that is certainly an assumption that's easily made when you're a true believing member of the church, or the Mormon, true believing Mormon. TBM is the acronym I'm going to be using, which stands for True Believing Mormon or Member. You make your call. So yeah, there's always assumptions that are made of why somebody leaves the church. It wasn't. I will tell you now, it wasn't from a lack of effort. It wasn't from the need to live more, in the world, as the Mormon community might call it, and as I used to call it. It has nothing to do with that. It was just coming across some information, a lot of information that I'm going to share at a super high level on this video, and I'm going to point you to which video in my 4-part series if you care to go on the deeper dive. So, but you come across this stuff, and I just can't, with good conscience, remain in the church, and so that's really what it boils down to. And so I wanted to provide something for anybody that might be out there, especially those that I might be connected to already, that are questioning things, that need somebody to talk to. I will tell you this: my wife and I, we went through this journey together, which was absolutely vital. But the other thing is, we had some people very close to us that we were able to talk to. And I think that we would have been in a really bad place had we not had somebody to talk to. So in an effort to be yet another person to be able to talk to, if you're questioning things in the church, you can go talk to the bishop, you can talk to people in the church, but what you're going to get probably are answers that are like, faith promoting answers. And I'm not trying to tear you away from the church at all. But I do think that it's important to look at all the information out there. And in my 4-part series, I actually focus very hard on church provided or church sponsored documents. So I don't, I'm not getting into what you might call so much anti-Mormon material. I'm pointing you to the sources that I went to when they were shown to me to confirm, because a lot of it I'm like, no way that's out there on the church's website. It is. And sometimes it's not as easy to find. But anyway, I'm not going to go into all the details on this video. We're going to go high level. I've written a couple letters to one, the first presidency, the other one straight to the prophet himself. I will go ahead and read those as we get to that point in this video. So let's get going. So I'm going to go just in the same order of the 4-part series. Only I'm just going to scream through the topics because, like I said, it was 6 hours, and it was actually a lot of fun to put together, a lot of fun to research, and I also point toward other sources. There's some others out there that have created some really great content to consume. I would say this though: you have to be ready to open your mind to consume this material, and also know that it was very difficult mentally to accept, to even learn. This stuff was so difficult mentally because it turned upside down, like basically our entire identity that was founded basically in the church. I mean, our complete upbringing, my wife's, and I'm not going to try to tell too much of her story because that's hers, but mine is kind of a story of I'm in the church, out of the church, in the church, out of the church. It was kind of interesting, but a lot of who I am was built on the foundation of the church, and so it was actually extremely difficult to learn some of the things that I learned, and I would say that we went through a mental health, emotional roller coaster over the last year. And so just know, and that's another reason I want to put this out there, is to provide a place where folks can reach out and talk, because it is not easy. But I am very happy with where we've landed. And I would say that I am more happy now than I think I've ever felt in my life. And I feel more love for others and myself than I've ever felt in my entire life. I'll get more into that as we close. Part one is I basically go over, I moved 18 times before I graduated high school. My dad has been married a few different times, and then there's a lot of these moves that had nothing to do with different stepmoms or anything that I've had. But it does, when you do have a marriage, it seems like that always encompassed like 2 to 3 moves. But we were pretty much, we didn't stay put a whole lot. There was a general area I grew up in Taylorsville, Utah. I call that kind of where my roots are. But in that area, I think I've lived in like 4 or 5 different houses. I think 4 different houses right there in that, like even in the same neighborhood. So, but yeah, so we moved a lot. My parents were divorced when I was really young. And after they got divorced, and after my dad had already remarried somebody else, my mom actually passed away when I was 9 years old from a car accident. And so she was driving very intoxicated, and she ended up hitting a semi. She was driving the wrong way on the freeway, and she hit a semi and was killed instantly. The good thing, if they're, the silver lining, I guess, if you will, is that that nobody else, to my knowledge, was injured in that accident. That would be absolutely devastating if she would have taken somebody else with her. But so that was a really obviously giant thing in my childhood that kind of changed a lot of my perspective. I get into that in a lot of details in that part one, but it was very difficult growing up without a mother. Now I did have mother figures, and credit to those, especially the one that was my stepmom at the time. And her and her kids, I still consider family. I love them all very much. And I think that they've kind of stuck with me as family figures, even though legally they're not. Uh, I think partially because of they were my family when I'd gone through this great trauma with the loss of my mom. So I don't know. We could psychoanalyze that whole situation for probably hours, but yeah, it was interesting to grow up without a mother like my mother. It was weird for me when I would be with people that had a mom, and it was just really strange. But um, what was interesting though, growing up, is that my activity in the church seemed to always depend on, and uh, my dad, I love you, Dad, might disagree with this, but it really did seem like, as I look back on my Mormon story, it felt like it all depended on which stepmom we were with. If they were really strong and active in the church, then we were. At least I was. I was baptized shortly after I turned 8 years old. Um, this first stepmom that I had, that's who we were with. That's where when I got baptized. And so, and then the next one didn't seem. I don't remember a whole lot of church activity. And then the following one, I do remember a lot of church activity, and that was when I was in high school. Uh, my junior year, I went to 3 different high schools, which was very, very difficult as a teenager, where friends mean everything, but you're like switching high schools all over the place. That was difficult. That was probably my hardest year. Um, but I was active in the church that year. And so that was kind of cool. I was a seminary class president, and I was just killing it as far as the gospel goes. And then, after the next year, we had moved again after that marriage fell apart. And so my senior year, I wasn't active in the church. And in fact, what I was active in is I was sexually active with a girlfriend that I had in high school. And so that's kind of interesting because, like, during that senior year, I felt kind of guilty a little bit, but then I was like, hey, this is cool. I'm not trying to promote, um, this activity, but at the same time, I also now recognize that developmentally, uh, this this happens, and whether you like it or not, I know in the religious communities it's very frowned upon to have any premarital sex outside of marriage. What's interesting to learn is that as far as like the level of sin goes, this is something that's placed right next to murder. And so what I didn't realize is how worthless this was going to make me feel when I got reactivated to the church. So that same time period, I got reactivated to the church by my grandpa, and who I was living with at that time. And gosh, the church, the church really helped. Like it makes you. At least this is how I felt. I felt that I was just completely worthless uh, when I went back to church. And it was interesting though, because I was able to compartmentalize this and be like, yeah, this is great. I'm in church. This is wonderful. However, when I was actually at the time, and I didn't realize this at the time that I hadn't made this connection, but I was strongly considering going into the military. My grandpa was a veteran, and he was talking to me a lot about the military, and I started looking into all the branches, and I was super hyped. I was ready to go. In fact, I was gonna sign up to try to be an airborne medic. I was an EMT at the time. I worked on an ambulance, and so this kind of fit right in my interests. So I was gonna try to go be an airborne medic, knowing that that was gonna be a very dangerous job, knowing that my life could absolutely be in danger. But I remember vividly going, I actually don't care, because I wasn't I wasn't suicidal, but mentally at the time I was like, hey, I get to go adventure, and if I die, I die. I actually don't care if I die. And that's interesting looking back on that. the feeling of worthlessness that I felt. And now I'm seeing that, as I'm trying to go back to church and realizing that, I'm committing sins that are next to murder, and how worthless I felt. And I've never been diagnosed with depression or anything like that, suicidal ideations, anything like that. But I didn't care if I died. That was interesting. But then I was approached, hey, by the bishop, hey, you ever thought about a mission? I'm like, no, I've never thought about a mission, not interested. And then, just different pressures. I don't know if pressures is the right word, but, folks that I worked with on the ambulance, they were active members. And so, a lot of conversation about missions. And finally, like the night before I was going to sign into the Army, I decided, I should probably pray about this. So I prayed about it, decided, oh my gosh, I should go on a mission. So I went and talked to the bishop, and the bishop's like, all right, let's talk about your past sins. And I just completely unload on him. Poor guy. And so he's like, well, all right, well, we've got a lot to work on. We're going to have to wait a year before we go to the temple, and so we did. We worked on all these things, and then I ended up getting a mission call to Brazil. And overall, my mission experience was pretty good. I served with some phenomenal people, great companions. Some I got along with better than others. Met some incredible people that we taught the gospel to, baptized and everything. And overall, the mission experience was pretty good. And I go back into a lot more detail there in part 1 of my series. But, which is kind of a teaser, I guess, due to the level of poverty that we felt there, I did engage in, well, not purposely, but I did engage in drinking water that was composed of decomposing body. So I'm going to just put that teaser out there and let you go find it in the part 1. When I got back, though, I got married real quick. My wife, I was going to say this gal, she's so freaking awesome. So Kimberly, we dated a little bit before I left. We met in high school, and so we were in social dance together in high school, and I think that's how I got her attention, is my sick dance moves. Not really, but we dated after high school because I had this other girlfriend during high school. But anyway, we get married, and immediately we're fighting infertility, and so our testimony is being shaken. God doesn't love us. These are all the feelings that we're feeling. At that time, we're getting callings that are supposedly from God. We got called into the nursery when emotionally we can't stand being around other children. And then we get called into the nursery. There's a lot of different callings that I go into in this series that made us really question if these callings did actually come from God, or if it was just a necessity and we're supposed to believe they came from God, and so forth. So there's a lot of that stuff in here. Building a family. So because we were not able to have our own children, we did end up adopting 2 children. Wonderful kids. They're 13 and 14 right now. And let's see, right now it is March 14th. It is Pi Day of 2024. And one's 13, one's 14. The 14-year-old is a Caucasian male from Utah, from northern Utah. The other boy, the 13-year-old boy, is a biracial boy from Ohio. And so that plays a part here a little bit later, having a child who is a person of color. So that plays a really big part here. Sorry, I'm got this little bit of a cough going on. So good thing I've got a little mute button here. And so, we just get into family stuff, callings, and then we jump into part 2. Part two, I get into a lot of, building. You hear this term, what broke your shelf, when you leave the church, or when you lose faith in something or belief in something. It's like you put a lot of items on your shelf, these callings that we had. It was like, yeah, that's odd, but you don't focus on those things. You're taught in the Mormon church not to focus on those things. You go find faith promoting items, and you work on building your testimony, not allowing these little annoyances, or whatever you might call them. They're much more than annoyances, in some degree. Being called into the nursery, that was annoying. Being told, hey, you should pay your tithing monthly instead of annually, because don't you want the blessings all year, not just once a year? That was annoying. But it wasn't like a faith destroying item. It was just like, all right, well, this person is a person. I'm going to put that on my shelf. And so in part two, we kind of build up that shelf, different church issues leading up to the big shelf breaker. But first, I get into my profession. So I am a fraud investigator by trade. And a lot of this stuff that I get into in this series, and a lot of the way that I think critically about the church, is in terms of fraud. Fraud can be probably more universally defined as the intentional deception to get something you're not entitled to. So one of the biggest thing is that it is intent, the intentional deception. So I use that a lot in the way that I think about the church. And so as we go through my career, I share a few stories. These are just little shelf items. It's like, oh, a bishop is paying your restitution for the crime you committed against my company. So that was kind of annoying to know that funds that people donate to the church are being used to pay for somebody's criminal activity. That was really obnoxious to find out. We ended up taking I shouldn't say we really took the company down, but a guy, we found a really good fraud case that ended up getting settled outside of trial. But it was, one of these guys that was part owner, he was prepping, allegedly, the rumor had it, that he was moving work away from off of his plate so that he could become a general authority. He was a stake president at the time. And the whole time he's committing fraud. And we had really, really good evidence that he was very complicit in this fraud. And, right before the next general conference, a search warrant was served. And in the general conference, turns out that, one more general authority was released than what was called. Now, whether that's coincidence, whether that would have been already, I don't know. But what I do know is the guy was a stake president, very high calling in the church, and was extremely dishonest in his dealings. And one of the temple recommend questions is if you are honest in your dealings with your fellow man. And let me just take a break here and get into that, actually. One of the articles of faith, I think it's the 13th, starts with, we believe in being honest. And I'm sure all my TBM people out there are finishing that in their head. True, chaste, benevolent, something like that. I don't know how it goes exactly. It starts with, we believe in being honest. The 12th article of faith is centers around that we believe in being subject to kings, priests, residents. I can't remember exactly how it's worded. It's in the videos, but anyway, and obeying the law. So those are two articles of faith that we're going to talk about. And then the second article of faith. Now, the article of faith, if you don't know what those are, the articles of faith, Joseph Smith was asked way back when by, I think he was a reporter in Chicago, said, okay, what do the Mormons actually believe? And so Joseph Smith basically laid out 13 articles of faith. It's basically like the 13 basic beliefs, the 13 beliefs that kind of encompass who we are as Mormons. So to me, you don't break those, especially if you're a prophet. But then again, like high levels in the church. Now, I'm also really, I try to be really careful of, these are people, these are men or women, but in this case, they're all men. And men are fallible. So like, I want to give them grace to be able to make mistakes and not like judge the church based off of their mistakes, especially like one of our bishops growing up, advised my dad, or advised his now ex-wife to leave without talking to my dad. This is actually my dad's story. I'm just like telling it how I experienced it. But I know my dad was pretty upset with this bishop, and I get that for sure. But at some point, like you have to look at the local leadership, even the leaders, like even the bishop, and say, all right, oh man, there's an episode on Mormon Stories podcast that John Dehlin interviewed 4 different former bishops, and it is just tragic, the lack of training that these men get to take care of all these problems with the people. So I give a lot of grace to a man who is ill prepared to deal with the problems that he is supposed to be dealing with. And I try not to judge the church based off of the person. It's so hard. But I'm like, okay, but now you got a stake president who I know is a temple recommend holder, or at least he should be, to hold that calling. And I'm finding him being very dishonest, breaking the law, so I've got a big problem with that. And I get into more of this at even a higher level than a stake president. And then the second article of faith we're going to get into is we believe that men will be punished for their own sins and not for Adam's transgressions. So we'll get into that one. But let's see. So we've got some articles of faith that I've got some issues with through time, and I'll kind of show you a little bit here. Again, I'm trying to keep this video a little bit shorter. So I mentioned we've got an issue with tithing. We always paid tithing. But the way that I was scrutinized by the way that I paid tithing really bothered me, because I always felt like, no, this is between me and God. It's not between you, Bishop. If I pay it once a year and I give you all the interest that my tithing has gained, I'm not wealthy, and so it wasn't a lot of money, but I emptied that account every year. All the interest and everything that it gained throughout the year, I gave all that to the church, because it's like, this isn't my money, this is God's money. Well, I got a problem with you calling me out saying, well, don't you want blessings all year? I think God knew what my intentions were. So that's how I saw it at the time. And then watching again how some bishops use the tithing money is just disgusting to me. So disgusting. Not just bishops, the church. There have been hundreds of millions of dollars in tithing money that has been paid to cover up sex abuse cases, to protect the good name of the church, to silence the victims. It's just disgusting. So disgusting. And I give some examples. You can look it up. I mean, the Scouts, for one, they offered $250 million to protect their name. And the judge thankfully said, no, that's not how this works. You can't get that type of protection. But hundreds of millions of dollars that the church pays out in covering up sex abuse that happens by its members. And a lot of that can be avoided, I think, by, I won't get into it. I'm not trying to fix the church. But the church doesn't do a whole lot to prevent it. Let me just say that. But they do a ton to hide it. And that bothers the hell out of me. The shame cycle. Oh my gosh. If you commit a sin, You've got to skip the sacrament, which is supposed to be technically the medicine that helps you get well when you're sinning. When you've broken your baptismal covenants, you're supposed to renew those covenants, but yet you're going to be held away from that medicine. Drives me nuts. The amount of shame in the church, and like I said, I was at the lowest of lows, not caring if I lived because of the shame that I felt because of the things that I've done, and that's just crap. One of the biggest things, again, these are all things that are just going up on the shelf. We're just loading up my shelf. November 15, in November of 2015, the church announced a policy against the LGBTQ community. And it was just disgusting. Now at the time, I'm like, well, I'm true believing Mormon here. I'm going, well, maybe God really doesn't like gay people. Well, but we're all children of God, so he's got to love them. And I'm like really struggling with this, right? Well, I'm going, okay, but let's give God the win here and say, well, no, he doesn't necessarily like the activities that queer people engage in. So let's just give him that win. Now, I'm gonna say right now that is not how I feel, but that's how I felt at the time. But then you prohibit their children from participating in church ordinances. That's where you violate the second article of faith that says, we believe that men will be punished for their own sins and not for Adam's transgressions. So if same-sex couples engage in sexual activity, you want to put the label of sin on that. Well, what does it have to do with the child? Now, the church came out and was like, no, we're trying to protect the family. If you're a child growing up in the church and you're allowed to be baptized and all this stuff, and your parents are gay, then you're going to learn what sinners your parents are, and it's going to basically drive a wedge in your family. And so we're going to help avoid that. Well, basically what you did is you took the free agency away from this person who wants to be baptized, and you just didn't give them that option. You basically punished them for their parents' sins. Some might see that different. I see it as you're punishing your children. You're punishing the children of the queer couple, basically. And I apologize to any of my LGBTQ plus friends out there if I'm using the wrong terminology. I'm not super educated. I'm trying to be. So, but that just absolutely pissed me off. And at that time, I stopped wearing my garments, and that shook my faith to the absolute core, because I'm like, how can our prophet, how can our first presidency and the Quorum of the 12, how can they all agree on a policy that, in my opinion, was rooted so deep in hate for the LGBTQ community that they're going to punish their children? And I know there was a mass exodus of folks, of members of the church at that time, but they ended up reversing this policy a few years later. And I was like, okay, well, I'm not one of those like, hey, told you so, but I was right. I was like, well, they're just a bunch of old men that don't understand. They're trying to run a church in a complex world. I gave them a lot of grace, and I was like, all right, I'm back. You guys screwed up, but I'm back. Sorry about that. I probably should have just recorded this when I'm feeling a lot better. And actually, I might. If you don't see this one, it's because, well, I did it again. And then again, like all the sex abuse cover-ups, they hit the news. There's a big one in Arizona. Right now, there's a big one in Pennsylvania, which is really interesting. Virginia and Pennsylvania. Anyway, really interested to see where that one goes. The stake president was arrested for not reporting sexual abuse that was reported to him. So I'm all for it. You may not know this, I've learned this through these years, that when a bishop has questions on how to proceed in one of these situations where sex abuse is brought to their attention, from my understanding, through a bunch of interviews of victims that I've heard, one in particular that was actually two that received they received a financial incentive from the church to not talk, and actually had to sign non-disclosure agreements, so they can't talk about what the amount is or anything like that. It's a lot of money. And so I've learned through that. And then I also learned through these bishops that were interviewed, these former bishops. When you have one of these situations, you call a helpline. That helpline rings to a law firm that I cannot stand with any fiber of my being. I absolutely hate this law firm called Curtin McConkie. You call this law firm, and their job is risk management. Their job is not to help the victim. Their job is to help the church. And how are they going to do that? They're going to tell you, they're going to find ways why you shouldn't report. The church has been so active in legislation across the country to fight mandatory clergy reporting. And I know there's a lot of opinions on this, but they've spent so much money on fighting these laws as they go through their legislatures to not have to report sexual abuse. Yet we're sitting here going, no, we're all about families. But if a child is sexually abused, we're gonna make a point not to report that. That's absolute bullshit in my mind. And so that's Curtin McConkie's job, is risk management. That's all it is. And it's insane. It's disgusting. That was another huge thing that went up on the shelf. And I'm like, Kate, that one, I've got to work through that one, because that one's not one that I'm just going to excuse like one of these simple callings that I don't believe came from God. This is a tough one. So I'm dealing with things, through these years. I'm dealing with a lot of things, kind of questioning the church. Okay, next part 3. If you want an explanation, I'm not saying that I'm the expert. I do work in fraud, and I walk you through a really, really good timeline of events that were outlined in a court order by the SEC that was agreed upon by the church, between the church and the SEC, which is the Securities and Exchange Commission, of a fraud that was being committed over 20 years by the first presidency in conjunction with a company called Ensign Peak. I walk you through that. It's disgusting. In a very brief synopsis, shell companies were used to basically hide the wealth of the church. When discovered that the person running the shell company was an employee of the church, they approved for more shell companies to be created. Once that was discovered, they approved even more shell companies to be created. Ensign Peak even had an internal auditor, an internal audit report come back in 2014 that said, hey, this isn't okay how we're reporting these finances through these shell companies. We really should question this. They ignored it. In 2017, another internal audit came back, said, hey, we shouldn't be doing this. They ignored it. Now, the culture of the church starts when you're in primary. There's a song called Follow the Prophet. There's a lot of brainwashing songs, but there's a song called Follow the Prophet. And it goes through 9 different verses. First, it talks about Adam, then Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Samuel, Jonah, and then Daniel. And then the last verse, I'll just read it. You don't want me singing this. Now we have a world where people are confused. If you don't believe it, go and watch the news. We can get direction all along our way if we heed the prophets, follow what they say. Follow the prophet, follow the prophet, follow the prophet, don't go astray. Follow the prophet, follow the prophet, follow the prophet. He knows the way. That chorus is, again, repeated 9 times. 54 times during that song, you say, follow the prophet. So we're taught the prophet is the voice of God on earth. He knows, he communicates with God. He receives instruction from God. So now you've got this structure that all throughout our lives, we're taught, do not question the prophet. In fact, President Oaks actually has a talk where he says, do not question leaders of the church, even if your concerns are valid. Like, what kind of crap is that? Do not question the church, even if your concerns are valid. Like, so we're in a culture where you're not supposed to question. So now put your shoes in the leaders at Ensign Peak. When the first presidency, and it's very clear in this order, I walk you through it. Go watch part 3. I think it's great, but it's very clear in the order, in the court order, that it's the first presidency that authorizes any activity, any deviation from the plan that Ensign Peak goes through. So, with this sentiment of follow the prophet, don't ask questions, now an internal auditor comes back and says, hey, I don't think this is right. What are you going to do as a leader? Are you going to go back to the prophet and say, hey, about that thing you authorized, I don't think that's correct? You probably are not going to go back to the prophet and question him. Why? Because you're not supposed to. So that's the culture of the church. And that's the setup for just, I'll say it, it's a setup of a cult. Sorry to say, that's a harsh word, but it is a setup of a cult. All right, so I'm going to read for you. At this point, this is last February. I go through the court order, go through it with my wife. We actually watched an episode on Mormon Stories podcast. This is where we got introduced to Mormon Stories, but an attorney that actually works in SEC type stuff kind of breaks down this court order. I had already done that in a way. He brought more light to it and broke it down into layman's terms. And so at this point, after we go through this, I'm like, Kate, I need answers. We need answers. We need answers, but not from our bishop, not from the stake president. We need answers from the first presidency. So I wrote a letter. I didn't believe they would respond to it, but I wrote a letter anyway. So let's go ahead and share that letter. We'll read it. We'll read it together. First Presidency, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, blah, blah, blah. Dear brethren, I'm writing you hoping you can help me find peace with something I'm deeply concerned with. I know your standard operating procedures are likely to have me go through my local leaders for this, but I do not believe my bishopric, my stake presidency, nor anyone in the Quorum of the 70 owes me an explanation. Being the ones directly involved, you are the ones that owe me this explanation. The concern I have is with the recent order from the SEC regarding activity the church and Ensign Peak advisors engaged in for over 2 decades. I will start by mentioning that by profession, I am a fraud investigator. So by nature, I pay close attention to one's integrity, their actions, and the intent of those actions. I presume you have read the entire order, but in the event you have not, I have included it here with my letter. Now, I'll pause there just real quick, just so you know, like, these orders take both parties to agree on the content that goes into these court orders. So I know they've read it, or at least their attorneys have read it, but just because I'm a snarky a-hole, I was like, hey, I'll give you a copy of it. In the reading through the facts, starting on page 3, I cannot get past the realization that my own prophet and his counselors were committing fraud. I'm sure fraud can be defined in many ways throughout the world, but in my industry, it is defined as the intentional deception to gain a benefit you are not entitled to. Regardless of the reason for hiding these investment portfolios, whether it be from the media, the streets, as mentioned in the facts, or from the membership of the church. The fact is that Ensign Peak advisors went to great lengths to hide this information through the means of intentional deception, using the exact methods I find people using in my investigations at work, for which they get criminally prosecuted. What is worse, all of this seems to have been approved by the first presidency of the church. You may not have given the exact roadmap for them to follow, but you gave very clear direction to be careful to keep it confidential. The church's press release on this matter, along with the FAQs, mention all was done under legal advice. I am very curious who those attorneys were and if our temple recommend holding members of the church. President Faust was one of the President Hinckley's counselors at the inception of this activity. And as you know, he was a very smart attorney prior to his service with the church, not to mention at one time the president of the Utah Bar Association. I have a hard time believing he did not know, nor the fact that our seers and revelators had no inkling they were committing fraud. The church's press release on this matter seemed to be designed to draw the reader's attention to the fact that it had been reporting correctly for the last 13 quarters. While this is commendable, this is exactly what the subjects of my investigations do when they are caught. They try to make it right. The parties at question here, when exposed in the early 2000s, did not make it right, but rather went to great lengths with the approval of the first presidency to further cover up what they were doing through the creation of multiple fake companies designed to draw attention away from the truth. The best word I can come up with is that I feel betrayed, not by my Heavenly Father or my Savior, but by the man I have looked up to, that I have loved and admired. I was reactivated to the church when I was around 20 years old and was inspired in many ways by our prophet at the time, President Hinckley. I quickly got myself worthy and ready to serve a mission in Brazil from 2001 to 2003, and then married my amazing wife that same year in the Salt Lake Temple. All the while, these men, whom I have looked up to, were committing fraud. For whatever reason their reasoning may be, I'm not sure how I can continue answering the question in my Temple Recommend interviews, asking if I am honest with my fellow man, knowing that my prophet, his counselors, and every presidency leading back to 1998 was not. How can I support and sustain you with this knowledge? How are your actions and those of your predecessors in line with the 12th and 13th Articles of Faith? My intentions are to live a fulfilling life, serving and loving those around me as I believe Christ would. Whether I remain active in the church or not greatly depends on if I can regain trust in you, the top leadership of the church. I need to know you and your predecessors were not intentionally deceiving others with the intent to hide something you had no rights to hide from the public. I need to know that you, too, were honest in your dealings with your fellow man. I hope you can find the explanation. I hope you can help me find the explanations I am looking for, and I will continue praying and searching the scriptures for answers and peace. Sincerely, your brother in Christ, Jason L. Bailey. Tuscany Ward, I said 4th Harriman Stake. It's actually Fort Harriman Stake. So I sent off, and I'll tell you what, I was terrified. I was so terrified to send that to the first presidency because I was like, dude, they're going to come knocking on my door. I actually kind of hoped, but they didn't. I heard nothing. And so after waiting just a little bit, I actually went to my bishop too before I sent that off. And I just asked him, I'm like, this is like an organization. Did you get any talking points or anything? Because like in a company structure, a lot of times when something like this might happen, you'll get talking points to talk to your team or, those who you're leading. He hadn't heard of it. He went looking. He's a great man. He really tried to find answers for us, but the answers weren't there. And I didn't expect them to be. I didn't expect the bishop or the stake president to have answers, the area authority. It's not their job. They weren't the ones approving this action. It was the first presidency, and that's what I expected. So I know those are high expectations, but hey, if you're the one committing the fraud, you're the one that needs to explain to me how I'm supposed to trust you. So that was a huge thing. And by now, shelf is coming down, right? So so one of the things in the church is you're taught do not engage, don't question your faith. I remember specifically, I think it was President Ballard. A lot of talks are like this in general conference, are like doubt your doubt before you doubt your faith. So I'm like totally in that mode all along with these different shelf items. I'm like, nope, church is true. I know it's true. And so I'm doubting my doubts, but now I'm going, okay, I'm done doubting my doubts. I just learned that my prophet and the last 20 years worth of prophets have been committing fraud. And I don't see it any other way. There is no question to me that there was intentional deception to hide that money. You don't create shell companies on accident. That is intentional. It's brought to your attention multiple times that this isn't right. That's intentional to just keep moving forward. So you will never convince me, I think, that that was intentional. So I'm going, okay, now it's time to try to understand how 20 years worth of prophets could engage in fraud and still be considered prophets. So I'm like super questioning the legitimacy of these men, right? So I start looking into history of the church, knowing that a lot of people have problems with the history of the church. So I come across gospel topics, essays. I come across a lot of material. I read Rough Stone Rolling that is sold at Deseret Book. I basically, now the prophet always says, only look at church approved material. So I'm like, okay, I'm trying to do that. But as an investigator, I don't just do that. Like I'm looking for truth. I'm not just looking for what you claim to be the truth, because you've already violated my trust. So, but in all reality, and I walk you through this in part 4, in all reality, all this stuff is there on church approved, in church approved material. Sometimes you have to kind of look for it, but so I knew polygamy was a thing. What I didn't realize is that Joseph Smith used his position as the prophet to coerce people to accept his marriage. What I didn't realize, I go over Lucy Walker's story in her autobiography and in her journals. I actually have 2 books here. You might consider these to be non-faithful material. There's no camera. In Sacred Loneliness by Todd Compton. This is a book about Joseph Smith's wives. And then this book is In Sacred Loneliness, the Documents. This book is basically like shows you all the sources that he used for his first book. And it's like their journal entries. Not all of them kept good journals, but a lot of them talked. And so, this wife might write about that wife's experience. And so he kind of tried to piece it all together as well as he could. His deception with his wife, Emma, as he was engaging in this polygamy is pretty disturbing. The foremost scholar on the planet, I think arguably Richard Bushman, who wrote Rough Stone Rolling. Again, this book is sold in Deseret Book, goes over some of this stuff. Very disturbing things that I never knew about Joseph Smith. Lucy Walker wanted to die. but he used his position of authority of being a prophet and would ask him on a couple different wives, do you believe I'm a prophet of God? Yes. Well, God has commanded me to marry you. Like, that's just complete bullcrap to use that position. So this is where I go, okay, is he a horrible man? Or like, do I judge him as a man or as a prophet? Well, he's using his position in the church as a prophet. And so I'm going to judge the church. I'm going to judge God. If God actually did this, then I'm judging God now. And like, this is going a lot deeper than I ever thought it would go. So you've got polygamy. And again, in part 4 of that series, I'm showing you some of the stuff that I'm coming across. Polyandry, I had no idea what that was. Joseph would send people on a mission, not all the time on mission, but like some of these guys, he would send on a mission. They're married, send them on a mission, then marry their wives while they're gone. Or other ones, he would just so boldly be like, hey, I'm going to marry your wife also. And anyway, his youngest wife was 14 years old, married a couple of 16-year-olds. Church apologetics would say, no, that was kind of normal back then. Actually, it wasn't normal back then. So if you told that same story today and put Warren Jeff's name behind it, you'd be like, oh, that disgusting pig. But if you're taught to believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God, that he restored the gospel, then you get really defensive with that. And I understand that. This is a difficult one to hear. And you may not believe it. That's fine. I did believe it. And I show some of the evidence in my part 4. You can argue it. I don't care. But I believe now that Joseph Smith was really a disgusting man. And there's other things about Joseph Smith. I'm not getting into them. I didn't get into them here. Maybe I'll get into them later. Racism. The Book of Mormon is clearly racist. When the Lamanites were so sinful that their skin turned dark, again, the church is going to say, nah, it didn't mean literal skin. You know what? It did. It was very clear, in my opinion. It was literal skin. And then the actions of the church, different prophets who are supposed to be receiving they're the word of God, right? No, they're dead now. So maybe their word doesn't count anymore. But I always learned that if it was in the scriptures or it came from the prophet, it's from God, right? So different prophets taught that black people, this is earlier in the church, this has been disavowed, but taught that black people were less than valiant in the pre-existence. That's why their skin is dark. Prophets after them have made, they've done some things with the Native American Indian tribes, trying to integrate them into Mormonism and encouraging marriages between white people and Indians. And I'm sorry if I'm using this, I don't mean to be insensitive, but to the Native peoples, and in order to turn them more white and delightsome. I mean, those terms were used by prophets. So there's just so many things throughout the time that shows that racism was very much a thing. Brigham Young solidified this by saying that the blacks will receive the priesthood when after every white man has received the priesthood. Now, every white man, according to Mormon belief, every white man won't receive the priesthood until after the millennium. So that's when the blacks get to have the priesthood. And I know saying the blacks is a derogatory term, and I don't mean to be insensitive, derogatory, especially where I've got my own son who is black. That priesthood ban, though, those words that he said, in my opinion, made it to where no prophet after Brigham Young had the ability to reverse that without discrediting Brigham Young as a prophet. And then once you discredit somebody as a prophet, what happens to your faith? So now all of a sudden, through so many years, this race in the priesthood, it can't go anywhere because you've got this jackass in the second prophet of the church that has made it impossible for future prophets to reverse that. Okay, so there's that. There's a woman named Jane Manning James. I'm getting super passionate here. I apologize. There's a woman named Jane Manning James who was an early member of the church. Very, very faithful. Holy crap, she was faithful. She was black. She wasn't allowed to go to the temple, but she remained so faithful. Toward the end of her life, before she died, she was allowed to be sealed to Joseph Smith. She was sealed as an eternal servant to Joseph Smith. So you can't tell me the church isn't racist. And you say, well, these were men of their times. I get that. But guess what? There were a lot of people that did not believe in racism at the time either. Number one. Number two, is God racist? Would God permit a racist man to be his prophet, his mouthpiece on earth? I don't believe he would. So I've got a major problem with that. And then the racism, or the priesthood was allowed to be given to black people in 1978. We're told President Hinckley gives a talk about how beautiful this revelation. And I mean, it is a beautiful thing that they finally got it. Okay. But it wasn't for the reasons we thought. It wasn't because it was just time. And I go through it in part 4 in detail. I show you an interview that was held with LeGrand Richards, who was an apostle at the time. It's because they were building the temple in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, and they didn't realize how much Negro blood was in the Brazilians. And it's like, well, if we keep this ban, these people that are building the temple, that are donating their tithing to the temple, they're not going to be able to use it. So why did they lift the priesthood ban? Why did they discredit Brigham Young and lift the priesthood ban? Because of necessity. Because now you've got all these people with too much Negro blood that need to use the temple. Not only that, you're a decade after the whole civil rights movement. How does a prophet of God, why is a prophet of God so slow that it takes another decade after society says enough is enough to lift the ban on the priesthood? So racism is a huge thing for me. Temple ordinances. I didn't realize before that they were all stolen from the Masons. That it's all it was all just masonry. Joseph Smith became a master mason, and then he took all of their ordinances, modified them just a little bit, and then that was in our temples. And they keep changing. Now, how can they keep changing if it's from God? I didn't know this too, but before 1990, you actually had, you had to, you like slit your throat and you did a bowel, opening of the bowels, to basically symbolizing if you divulge this information, then you should die. And anybody that's gone through the temple before 1990 knows that those hand symbols are things that you did. Blood atonements are like, oh, ooh. Word of wisdom. I didn't know a whole lot about the word of wisdom, only just what we're taught in church, but that it was actually a movement at the time in basically like the health magazines or health articles called the temperance movement. It is basically word for word of the temperance movement. I don't believe that was inspired of God at all. Emma asked him, wouldn't it be nice if we had a revelation so I didn't have to clean up all this crap on the floor from the tobacco chewing? And next day, Joseph Smith has this revelation. So, yeah, I don't believe in that. Just all the hate toward the LGBTQ community. If God is truly our Father, would he permit such hate to be given towards his children? Now the prophets are changing their perspective. Oh, no, we love you. But how many people died? How many people committed suicide because of the hate they felt toward from the church? Not toward they probably reciprocated at some point. So, after all this, I just have to say, what is the value proposition of having a prophet? All of this that I've learned, all the deception, you say, well, men are fallible, prophets are fallible. Well, then at what point is having a prophet even valuable? Because if we're supposed to follow the prophet, then at what point do we get to start questioning that and say, well, the prophet's taking us down a dark path? I mean, if you look at cults throughout the world, and there are some cults that have committed like mass suicide. Why? Because they followed their prophet, right? And I'm not saying that President Nelson's going to lead us there, but what I'm saying is, at what point do you create an environment that is so trusting in their leader that they'll do anything? And I'll tell you what, studies will show this too. Fraud in the church is just incredibly rampant. Why? Because we're watching it. We learned it from the very beginning from our founder, Joseph Smith, that intentional deception to get something you want is fine. We've watched it from him on up to our current prophet, President Nelson. Intentional deception is fine. Fraud is fine. As long as it's if it's for the right reason, if it's to build the kingdom of God, then it's fine. So, I ended up writing. So after finding all this stuff out, looks like we're over an hour. All right, I'm going to wrap this up. After finding all this out, I thought, you know what? I wouldn't have looked this deep. I think maybe I would have had I got an answer right away. So I'm actually kind of thankful that I didn't get an answer. So again, being the snarky a-hole that I am, I decided I'm going to write Russell Nelson a letter. And so let's go take a look at that letter. All right, here we go. Oh, the last letter was written, let's see, March 7th, 2023. And then this letter was written October 4th, 2023. Now, again, I'm going to apologize, especially to my TBM people, friends, family. I do love you so much. Know that this was very difficult for me to process all of this stuff. Because I've believed in the church for a really great part of my life. And then after feeling so deceived, there's a lot of anger that comes out in this letter. But if I was to write it today, I don't think I would change it. I'm actually happy with how this letter turned out. There is a little bit of anger, but I felt very strongly that to show my kids what I believe integrity looks like is you're going to call somebody out when they're deceiving you. So that's what I'm doing. Okay. Dear Russell, I wanted to first reference the letter I sent to you on March 7th of this year. I addressed it I addressed it to the first presidency. I've included it here for your reference. Prior to sending it, I spoke to my bishop about my concerns, who in turn went to the stake president for counsel. I didn't expect much from them because, as I mentioned in my previous letter, I did not need answers from them. I needed answers from you. I want to thank you for not responding to my letter. I want to thank you for not responding to my previous letter because it gave me plenty of time to search for my own answers. I was able to spend time in the scriptures, looking through talks and other materials on the church's website, as well as reading a couple books. The resources ended up giving me a lot of new understanding of why things have happened the way they have. The first place I went in attempting to find answers to my concerns was through prayer and scripture. I searched for scriptures about false prophets. In Matthew 7:15-16, it states, "Beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. Ye shall know them by their fruits." I then contemplated what fruits were brought by you and your counterparts. Obviously, the concerns at the forefront of my mind had to do with the fraud carried out with the finances of the church. So in that realm, I really struggled to find any explanation on how you and your counterparts wouldn't be considered false prophets based on this issue alone. I don't want to discount any of the good things you have done, nor would I ever presume that you should be perfect in every way. But when it comes to your position in the church, with the trust everyone has put in you, I would expect you to resemble Christ-like attributes in carrying out your duties. I also contemplated how many thousands of people you have hurt through decisions made during your time in the leadership of the church. The first that comes to mind is the revelation on the policy change in November 2015 with the stance on the LGBT community and their children. When this change was made, I was serving in the primary. During sharing time, we were teaching the kids the second Article of Faith primary song. This is when it hit me that you and the rest of the top 15 of the church completely shredded the second Article of Faith by punishing kids for something their parents participate in, that you perceive as evil. How do you do that? Do we really believe that men will be punished for their own sins and not for Adam's transgressions? I know this was later changed, which I felt vindicated in a way for the feelings I felt toward it, but also it shows me that this was absolutely not a revelation, quote, unquote. When it was later changed, and that change was labeled also a, quote, revelation, unquote. Then, with the issue of the SEC filings, if we truly believe the Articles of Faith, how can this happen, especially for 20 years? The 12th, that's a nice typo right there. That's cool. The 12th Article of Faith states that we believe in being subject to kings, presidents, rulers, and magistrates, in obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law. Obeying the law did not seem to be something you were interested in sustaining when it benefited you and your organization. The 13th Article of Faith starts with, we believe in being honest. In the context of the SEC filings, you knew, along with Monson, Hinckley, and all of your respective counselors, that you were not being honest. The order specifically calls out calculated actions taken to keep things hidden by the formation of multiple fake shell companies to hide the money. Furthermore, creating fraudulent quarterly filings under those companies. How in any way is this being honest? While searching through the scriptures on prophets, I came across D&C 138. Whether by mine own voice or by the voice of my servants, it is the same. So, in the spirit of looking for more contemporary guidance, I also searched talks by general authorities. In searching out keywords such as deception, I came across a talk by Apostle Mark E. Peterson in 1982. While I would make a strong argument against him being a man of God, given so many things he said, the fact remains that he was allegedly called by God to be an apostle. So I, in the spirit of D&C 138, I will treat him as such. In his talk, he said, "Do we understand the gravity of the sin of dishonesty? It is not only unchristian, it is anti-Christian, it is anti-Mormon, it is anti-Christ. Whether it be lying or cheating, or robbery or deception, whether it is in the home, in business, in sports, or in the classroom." I'm so sorry. Dishonesty is completely foreign to the teachings of Jesus. If we do not recognize this, we are blind indeed. I personally couldn't agree more with these words, that dishonesty is completely foreign to the teachings of Jesus. Again, the issue that sent me down this path was trying to understand how every prophet for the last 20 years had been intentionally dishonest. Without your explanation, I don't know I will ever be able to understand this. More recently, when speaking to mission presidents, Elder Ballard in 2014 instructed the mission presidents, "Keep the eyes of the mission on the leaders of the church. We will not and cannot lead you astray." This reminds me of the primary song, "Follow the Prophet." We repeat that term, "follow the prophet," 54 times throughout the entirety of the song, frequently repeating the term, "don't go astray." This song insinuates the same message Elder Ballard instructed, that by following the prophet, you won't go astray. What I have learned from you and your predecessors is that following the prophet teaches us it is okay to commit fraud and be dishonest as long as it is for what you feel is a justified cause. Am I wrong? I also came across one of your talks from 2021, which I found very interesting. Your instruction is to take your question to the Lord and other faithful sources. Study with the desire to believe rather than the hope that you can find a flaw in the fabric of a prophet's life or a discrepancy in the scriptures. I love this counsel, but also wonder what faithful sources means. Is this only information created by the church or items one could find in church stores? I tried to keep it to those sources, but as a trained investigator, I seek any reliable source. This, to me, is like asking me to make a judgment on how I feel about Donald Trump, but only can research materials created by his team. Also, I don't only study with the desire to believe. I study with the desire to learn. You are a very smart man. You should understand this concept. I'm sure by now it is very clear I am questioning the legitimacy of our modern day prophets, including you. I was struggling because I knew I had a testimony of Joseph Smith. So where did we go wrong? I started looking into more of the writings about Joseph Smith and the early days of the church. Knowing many people struggle with the history of the church, I wanted to make sure I was reading, in your words, faithful sources. I read Rough Stone Rolling as well as many gospel topics essays on the church's website. I was appalled at what I learned about Joseph Smith, what he put Emma and many other women through, and the deception and coercion that took place for him to continue in his position. It was made very apparent to me that this type of thing, deception and manipulation, always existed in the church. So where does this leave me? I met you on June 13th, 2001 in the São Paulo MTC. The day you arrived, I was told by my instructor to shake your hand if I got the opportunity. In my journal on that day, I wrote, "When I shook his hand, this feeling came over me like none other feeling. I looked up in his eyes and I could see my Savior, Jesus Christ." I honestly don't know what to do with that experience now. Was it the mind manipulation the church is so good at? I was basically told how I should feel in that moment, and it was so. One of the things you said in that talk that I recorded in my journal was, "Be responsible for things in your control." Reflecting on that with today's issue, I would then say, you cannot blame legal counsel for the fraud. It was your responsibility to do something, not just because you were caught. It was within your control. In your latest address, you said, "Never take counsel from those who do not believe. Seek guidance from voices you can trust, from prophets, seers, and revelators." During my time of research thus far, I've learned I've learned from Joseph Smith the art of coercion, manipulation, deception, fraud, hypocrisy, and general lack of caring for anyone's well-being besides his own. Brigham Young sent quite a strong message of racism that was not rectified until 1978, but from what I've read, not for the right reasons. I learned a lot of things that seemed very ungodly about Mark E. Peterson when I looked into learning more about him after finding that wonderful quote I shared earlier. Most recently, in my time as an active member, I learned from Gordon Hinckley, Thomas Monson, James Faust, Henry Eyring, Dieter Uchtdorf, Dallin Oakes, and yourself that creating a fraudulent scheme is completely above board and carrying it out for decades is just as well. That the spirit of discernment of right and wrong doesn't exist, or if it does, it's okay to ignore it. That the 2nd, 12th, and 13th articles of faith don't really matter. I'll stop here, but could not conclude this letter without calling you out on your own words. We cannot just trust a prophet, seer, and revelator when their fruits do not support such a title. I know repentance is between you, your bishop, and your God. I hope to hear something from you, not just to me, but the millions of members of the church that you have lied to. You have violated the trust of so many and used your position to do it. In the church handbook, 32.6.1.4 indicates any serious sins while holding a prominent position in the church is subject to required membership counsel. I'm sure you and your leadership will not find that what you have done to fall within the definition of serious sin, but I would say that financial fraud at the level you and your predecessors have carried out could certainly land in that realm, not to mention the false revelation in 2015 that resulted in countless suicides and other mental health issues. All for what? I'm not convinced that was God's will. That was on you, and I let my bishop and counselor know in the stake presidency, and the counselor in the stake presidency know how I felt about it when I had a temple recommend renewed after it changed back. In closing, I ask you, do you strive to be honest in all that you do? The evidence points to no. To me, you are no more than a CEO of a corrupt organization. If only you would have simply retired as a doctor, I believe the world would have been a better place. Once again, thank you for giving me the time to find my answers and not responding more timely as to ensure my faithful Mormon blinders stayed on. Wow, so that's a fairly snarky letter, I know, but I feel great about calling him out on these things that he did. There's more. So I go into really deep detail in all of these videos in the playlist. I think I've got it listed as religion playlist. I don't have much on my site or on my channel, so it shouldn't be hard to find. But I would suggest listening to them in sequence if you're interested in seeing more details of all this stuff. But ultimately, where I landed is this. I found a deeper love for my local Mormon leaders. The bishop and his counselors are just fantastic men, and I felt genuine love from them. President Nelson apparently saw this letter and sent a message that he just said, let Brother Bailey know that I love him. Whether that's true or not, I'm going to tell myself, yes, the prophet did read my letter because it makes me feel good to know that he did read it. I doubt he did, but so leaving the church was very difficult. But the one thing I didn't expect is losing faith in a deity. I wouldn't necessarily say I'm now atheist, but the God that I've believed in, if he truly did command Joseph Smith to marry 14-year-olds and coerce, these young women or any women to marrying him. If he truly did, if this God is truly racist, if this God truly allows for his prophets to commit fraud, and then expects me to just follow the prophet, I'm not going to believe in that God. I don't want to put myself on a giant pedestal, but my integrity requires that I do not believe in that God, and I do not follow those prophets. So it was tough. It was a very tough decision when it comes down to it, because this is your complete identity that has been built on this gospel. And there's so many loved ones that are so disappointed in the fact that we've left. And to those people, I'm sorry you're disappointed. Just know this: it has nothing to do with lack of trying. When you learn this stuff, and if you believe that it's real, I don't see how I could possibly continue on in a place that's leaders, that I'm expected to support leaders that have done the things that I believe that they've done. So what I have found, though, through this journey is a much deeper love for myself, a much deeper love for my kids and my wife, and just humanity. Not being afraid of an afterlife, that not being afraid of a second coming. Now, I get that y'all believe it's coming. I'm not afraid of that stuff anymore. And the anxiety that I've felt for so many years, I shared this with my wife for the first time not long ago. I have been so afraid of the second coming because I didn't like the fact that my kids. Now, what's driven this is some very close to me. One person very close to me has a patriarchal blessing that states that she will be alive during the second coming. So I'm going, okay, this is in her lifetime. And I believed that. I believed that to like my core. What I learned is many of the first members of the church, many of them had that same thing in their patriarchal blessings. That's interesting, isn't it? But ever since I learned this about this person in my family, having this in her patriarchal blessing, I've known, and I'm going to put this in quotes, I've known that the second coming is going to be in my lifetime. And I was terrified of that because my kids weren't going to get the chance to grow up and have a family of their own and experience how wonderful life can be with a best friend / partner, potentially kids. And it just drove me nuts thinking that this is all going to come to an end before they even have a chance to do that and experience that. And that bothered me. Now I don't really know what is out there, and what's cool about that is I don't sacrifice today thinking about tomorrow. I focus more on being present today and living today. I'm not throwing tomorrow away, but we don't know if we even get a tomorrow. And so I'm just trying to make the best impact on my things that I can control. Humanity in general, I'm trying to make the biggest impact on those around me, positive impact. And you know what? If whatever comes, come what may, I I'm not living an evil life to where I think that I will be judged in any way. And let me tell you this: if God is real, and I am brought to a judgment, I have such a clean conscience that I can say, "Here's why I left you. Don't you understand why one would leave you in that circumstance?" And if that's not good enough, then so be it. But I honestly think that if there is a judgment day, that judging these men by their works in the name of God, they're carrying out these works in the name of God. Uh, I don't understand how a loving Father in heaven wouldn't accept that person into their realm. And I'm not going to get into the complexities of how a loving Father would allow such things to happen on earth. It's hard for me to reconcile anymore. So I don't try to, and I'm so much happier for it. So thank you for sticking out an hour and a half. That was pretty good. That's not 6 hours. That's pretty good. But yes, I encourage you, go through those videos. I go through a lot of detail. I share a lot more than I did here, especially detail wise. But love you all, and take care of yourselves, and remember who you are.